Hey guys, we had topic 7, which dealt with exchange rate regimes and international reserves. I'm Brady Jackson. I worked alongside Albert Lee and Julian Keeley for this project. Okay, so first off, I would just like to give you all a roadmap for our presentation. First, we will be looking at how the textbook deals with international reserves and what it says about the different levels of reserves a fixed exchange rate system should have compared to a floating one. Then we'll dive into the data, and Albert will explore what's actually happening in the real world. And then we'll delve into the previous literature on the topic and the traditional models on it. And then we'll address our main source, our paper, and try to offer an explanation as to what is going on. Okay, so a quick little intro on the topic. The basic textbook treatment on international reserves would have indicated that international reserves should have indeed fallen after Bretton Woods, but that's not exactly what we see happening, as we'll see later. Also, in a system of fixed exchange rates, central banks need international reserves to reserve their exchange rate pegs. In comparison, when the exchange rates are flexible, you need fewer official reserves since there's no need to protect peg exchange rates. So the central banks should not need to hold large buffers for foreign assets. So Albert's going to take this away as we discuss the data.
Right. So, as Brady mentioned, after Bretton Woods, what a lot of economists believed was that there would be a fall in the amount of international reserves that were actually being held by countries because there would be a lesser need to peg fixed exchange rates. That was the system before. So what we did was we looked at a bunch of real world data from the World Bank database, and we looked at total reserves, including gold, denominated in current U.S. dollars, and compared that to each country's GDP, denominated in current U.S. dollars. And we did that for a list of developed and emerging markets. And of them, the developed countries were about 10 or 12 developed countries that we would know, including Australia, Canada, Denmark, New Zealand, US, the UK. And then we looked at emerging markets, which included the following: Argentina, Armenia, Bangladesh, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Egypt, India, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, Senegal, South Africa, Turkey, and Venezuela. And we simply aggregated all the data from the World Bank database, and we came up with this chart right here. So for all the countries that were listed, we can see that generally it supports what the paper had talked about, which we'll discuss later on as well, which is over the period between 1980 up until about 2008, the trend for all the countries is fairly flat. And the fact that most of these countries, on average, have their reserves divided by GDP ratio between about 8 to 10%. But you can see that there's been a pretty big increase after the financial crisis, which we'll also discuss later on. So, what that average of all countries actually kind of hides is the fact that there's been differing trends between developed countries and emerging markets. So, if you look at this trend for developed countries here, you can see that after the end of Bretton Woods, there's been a significant decline in the amount of reserves that developed countries have held as a percentage of their GDP. So you can see that it's fallen from about 13% all the way down to about 6% before the financial crisis. But again, you can see that there has been a pretty sharp increase after the 2008 financial crisis. And again, we'll discuss why that is later on and why that might be. So that's quite interesting. What is most interesting, though, however, is when you look at the trend for developing countries, because you can really see that it's kind of like an inverted version of that developed countries graph. Instead of having a sharp decline over the last 30 years or so, developing countries have actually seen a pretty significant increase in the amount of reserves that they've held as a percentage of GDP. And this is really contrarian to what economists believed would happen, right? Because with countries no longer needing to peg a fixed exchange rate, we thought that these countries would have fewer and fewer international reserves in the bank. But you can clearly see from this graph that there's been a pretty sharp increase since the 1970s. So you can really see that the experience of these developing countries is really different from the experience of developed countries. So with that said, the paper that we have, and as well as existing literature, have quite a few numbers of explanations for why that might be, and we're going to be discussing all of that in the slides to follow.
Yeah. So as Albert was all saying, the collapse of the Bretton Woods regime after 1973 definitely shifted people's thoughts on the various arguments about reserve holdings and why countries hold international reserves and what's going on there. And as mentioned before, a truly floating regime doesn't really need reserves, as the textbook says. But that only works if governments aren't biased or don't care about their exchange rate level, but they clearly are, so it can't really work like that. And so just to give you some background on previous literature that our paper discussed and touched on, basically in the 1990s, various capital kept flowing in from rich to poor countries. And that led to the view that central banks' demand for international reserves could be explained as their attempt to avoid currency crises, which originated in the financial account and could inflict major reserve drains. And so the basic argument before this is that the short-term external debts were a driver and predictor of emerging market currency crises. Then a major rule came around in December in 1999. Actually, is when the rule was thought about in response to the December 1997 Korean crisis. So it was named after Alan Greenspan and Pablo Giudiatti, I believe. And basically, the whole idea is that the emerging market should have enough reserves to meet all debt payments scheduled over a one-year horizon. The basic argument for this is that it helps countries avoid the damage of sudden stops in capital inflows, which are defined as periods when access to foreign financing can dry up. Yeah, as I said before, it was named after Pablo Giudiatti and Alan Greenspan in 1999. It was supported by empirical research showing that short-term external debt appears to be a predictor of currency crises. And they actually drew on the logic of this from Keynes in his treatise on money. And in the treatise, he argues that central banks should calculate the right amount of free gold reserves by attempting to estimate, in quotes, the magnitude of the drain which it might have to meet through the sudden withdrawal of foreign funds, known as the external drain, or through a sudden drop in the value of Indian exports as a result of bad harvests or poor prices. So he basically says the amount of free gold reserves that should be held decreases with the variety of a country's trade and increases with the size of international financial and banking business in a country, which can be measured as a country's M2, as we'll see later on. And then just to give you an example of a bad trade deficit, because Keynes really talked about trade deficits and surpluses a lot on his treatise of money. Just to give you an example of that. So in a developing country, a bad example would be if a country's trade deficit was 5% of the GDP. But if this had to be financed out of reserves in a sudden stop, then the implied drain on reserves would only be about 0.1% of GDP per week. As you can see the math right there, which is known as a slow week. But then if we suppose there's also a short-term debt equal to 26% of GDP rolling over continuously, then the drain on foreign reserves would be 0.5% of GDP, as you can see there. So you'd much prefer the slow week.
These are just reserves drain pretty slowly in both these scenarios.
Right. But obviously the Giudiatti-Greenspan rule has its own shortcomings, or else there wouldn't be much debate on this whole topic in the first place. just to say, both the perspective from Keynes and Greenspan Giudice concentrate on external drains and ignore the influence that internal drains can have on external drains, and ignore the possible role of domestic residents' financial decisions. And major work by Larry Simmers, Olivier Gian, and Romain Ranchier found that countries hold reserves that are excessive relative to the Giudice-Greenspan benchmark. And this is because trade and debt criteria fail to explain the observed reserve holdings. They focus on external drain and sudden stops and ignore the possibility of internal drains. And so it definitely has its own shortcomings. And then so this leads to a whole puzzle. Not only has the trend in international reserves over GDP not behaved the way basic textbooks might predict, but there's also a puzzle over excessive reserves. This has led to some to suggest that the current level of reserves is beyond the explanatory powers of a rational economic framework.
So now I'll talk about how the argument that the paper we had to read makes to sort of explain that there actually isn't an excess of reserves and it's not irrational or anything. In the paper, they talk about the work of Henry Thornton, who wrote one of his works was called The Paper Credit of Great Britain. And in it, he basically makes the argument that the Bank of England should keep the level of gold reserves. The level of gold reserves should not be sufficient not only to counteract the effects of an unfavorable balance of trades, but also to meet any extraordinary demand at home that could arise from sudden frights. And essentially what they're getting at is that the reason why central banks hold reserves is not only to meet external drain, but also internal drain. So let me just be a little more clear. So external drain on a country's reserves, as you can see on the slides, is the sudden stop of foreign capital, or when the export of home assets from the perspective of the domestic country to foreigners suddenly stops. Whereas internal drain on a country's reserves is capital flight by domestic residents, or the import of foreign assets by domestic residents suddenly starts. And internal drain actually can be a much bigger drain on reserves than external drain. When Brady was talking, he gave some examples of the effects that external drain can have on reserves. Here's another actually pretty realistic example where we assume that M2, which is a measure of the money supply, is about 20% of GDP, and because of some sort of panic, half of M2 decides to flee the country. This could happen plausibly in a week or two, which would cause reserves equal to 5 to 10% of GDP per week to leave the country, which is an enormous drain on reserves. Something fairly similar happened in Argentina. Argentina in the 1990s implemented a currency board, which basically fixed the Argentine peso at a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the US dollar. And because of a deteriorating economic and banking situation in Argentina, and the IMF withdrawing its support of Argentina, on November 30th of 2001, basically $1.7 billion reserves were withdrawn from the banking system in the span of 24 hours. And the convertibility plan died a very quick death. And there are a few takeaways from this incident, which is, first of all, Argentina had a complete back end of the monetary base in dollars and reserves, but that was insufficient. What this example shows us is that large fractions of M2 left the country, and it made it, again, clear that having a near complete back end of the monetary base would be little to no help. So this brings us to the main argument in the paper that we read, which is essentially a primary reason for a central bank to hold reserves, with most central banks fulfilling the lender of last resort rule vis-a-vis the domestic banking system, is to protect the domestic banking sector and domestic credit markets more broadly. And a country's financial depth, which is basically the size of domestic financial liabilities that could potentially be converted into foreign currency or into, which we'll measure as M2, is what a country should base the adequacy of its reserves on. And these concerns are not simply about meeting an external drain, but also about a double drain, which would be an internal drain and an external drain at the same time. And so the trilemma essentially tells us that a country with financial openness and an exchange rate target will have to sacrifice monetary autonomy. Similarly, imagine a situation where there's a flight from domestic bank deposits into foreign exchange. This will bring foreign reserves and the exchange rate under extreme pressure by putting the banking system into meltdown and activating the central bank's lender of last resort rule. And again, just as in a situation where there's financial openness and an exchange rate target, a country's monetary policy autonomy is limited. In a similar situation with financial openness and exchange rate targets, it may be the case that a central bank needs to have large war chest reserves for its lender of last resort purposes when there is a risk of this double drain that we've been talking about. So that's their hypothesis, that the reason why central banks hold these reserves is to meet that double drain. And they tested in various regression models. And so the variables that they use in this model are the size of domestic financial liabilities that could potentially be converted into foreign currency, which they measure as M2 over GDP, financial openness, the ability to access foreign currency through debt markets, and exchange rate policies. And in the results, they found that there was a statistically robust and economically significant correlation between the reserve levels as measured by reserves over GDP with financial openness, financial depth, and exchange rate policy. So why is this the case? We've sort of explained it before, but I'll give you guys a quick recap, which is that as far as financial depth is concerned, as financial depth increases, the central bank will worry more about an internal-external double drain and will hold more reserves. And this will especially be true if the country is financially open and perhaps if its currency is pegged. Again, the reason for that is that financial openness, if financial flows cannot move across borders, so if you don't have financial openness, the likelihood of a bank run becoming a balance of payments crisis is much reduced. And then as far as exchange rate policy is concerned, you see the role of the trilemma here, which is that financial sector protection has always been an important motivation for reserve accumulation, especially when a country is trying to manage its exchange rates. A central bank that is not concerned by exchange rate movements may simply expand domestic credit in a banking crisis and allow the exchange rate to move if necessary. So as far as how this model performs, it performed much better in head-to-head comparisons with traditional models. And it basically showed that the amount of reserves, especially in developing countries, is not irrational. And using the variables and factors they use in their model, we basically the level of reserves being held is justified. And I just want to quickly go back to our data that we noticed in the graphs.
Or developing are showing signs of an increase in the amount of reserves that they're holding, in the amount of international reserves that they're holding. And as Julian mentioned here, really a lot of this is because post-crisis there's this perceived need to have that additional amount of international reserves in order to really protect the domestic financial markets. And this need, again, is no longer really confined to just developing countries. So I think there's a lot of value here that we've added in terms of just the last 7 or 8 years of analysis on top of what the paper discussed very in depth, which we've hopefully done a very good job of summarizing for you guys today.
All right, thank you very much.